All right, everyone, welcome back. I know that I just did a stream yesterday, so maybe you're not used to me streaming as often, but I did have an article published that took a while to get properly, I guess, properly formatted by the fuck is going on here. Um, it was taken down for because of website maintenance over the weekend, but it is back up and I did write it. So it is linked in the description. So, like I put the message up, read it. It is linked in the description, so you can read it. And it concerns a network that I've taken a lot of shots at over the years because the fact is that I do focus a lot on the difference between being ideological and being, I guess, being practical. And I think that the actions of this news network, which is not the largest news network, it's got a very modest YouTube following okay, I'm not saying that they have no following, but they only have, compared to some other networks, they have, about 400,000 subscribers, which is respectable, but it's not major. And for a full-fledged network that is trying to pose as an alternative source, it is not something where your YouTube views can be sustainable, certainly not in terms of revenue and not in terms of attracting donors and attracting people to spread your message. But it is a news source that has a fair amount of traffic on the far left here in the US and in Canada. And I do think that people who use the real news network overseas, it's what I would call a refuge for the internationalist left. People talk a lot about globalism and how it is propped up by multinational corporations, and a lot of those people are not far right. They're not people who embrace racial views or anything. It has nothing to do with racism, in my opinion, talking about globalism. A lot of the people who embrace that type of rhetoric are, do you guys want light or is this fine? Anyway, so a lot of those people are very, very far to the left, and what the left considers, I guess it's they call it internationalism. Internationalism has a lot to do with solidarity and supporting the oppressed across the world. And ideally, according to various streams of Marxism, especially Trotskyism, they do see in the end the breakdown of borders and the union of all working classes across the world. That's why, what's the common refrain of Marxists in almost every country? Workers of the world unite. It isn't workers of Romania unite, or the workers of Palestine unite, or the workers of Israel, or the workers of Turkey, or the workers of America. It's the workers of the world unite, because Marxism is, in most of its iterations, an internationalist movement. It is a different sort of globalism, and in many cases it is a rival of the other globalisms that people like to talk about. If you watch Steve Turley's channel, and I recommend it even if you're on the left or if you're someone who's more further to the right than Steve Turley, I think he's a very well-grounded individual in terms of his research and in terms of interpreting our world in comparison to the classical world, of antiquity and also of the Middle Ages, because he is truly a scholar of classical art, classical music, and all of that. And I believe he's also a musician. So he talks about three different globalisms that are a threat to national identity, right? So that's right, three. So one of the globalisms is the one that we talk about, which is corporate multinational globalism, the Koch brothers type, the open borders type. And that's something that I certainly, I was never really focused on. I certainly see the validity in criticizing it. I think it's impossible to look at it as a benign phenomenon at this point. That's only one type of globalism. The other two globalisms he talks about are Chinese expansionist globalism, which is talking about using debt traps in order to get other countries to succumb to your influence, and it's in a way it's similar to Western globalism. It's similar to what the United States, France, and Britain have done to other countries by turning them into debt, uh, you know, debt vassals. That's the best way to describe it. You have the IMF loan tremendous amounts of money to these economies, and because they're poorly planned and everything, they basically owe everything. I love Bold's taste in music, like a 60-year-old Southern woman. I missed the song today. That's funny. That was not that. I don't think that would fit into that. But I think you're right. Yesterday's maybe that's true. Yesterday's song was certainly something that you can make that accusation. But in terms of Marxism, it's so the third type of globalism that Turley talks about is Islamic globalism, which is a little different of a phenomenon. It has more to do with uniting everyone under caliphates and ultimately under a full caliphate. But this network believes in a different type of globalism that is not as in vogue as it was before the end of the Cold War. It is internationalist Marxism. It does not believe in international borders. It sometimes embraces woke concepts like social justice. Other times it doesn't. It's a very inconsistent type for the modern world, because if you go back to the world of the Soviet Union, the Soviets would probably look upon woke social justice today as some sort of perversion of what they were talking about. Not just the Soviets, probably people in countries like Vietnam and North Vietnam and eventually the United Vietnam, and unreconstructed versions of that. Countries like North Korea. Do you think that you can go to North Korea and arbitrarily change your gender, or just have polyamorous relationships and say that sex work is real work? I think that if you go there, they would find that, first of all, amusing if they have any sense of humor, and then second of all, they would probably execute you as some sort of deviant who is trying to undermine their ideology. So the woke left of today, the internationalist Marxist of today, is a little bit at odds with the Soviet system of pre-1989 and certainly of unreconstructed North Korea and some countries that have embraced that template in the past. So where do they get their guidance? They get their guidance from the Bolivarian Revolution. 21st century Bolivarian socialism is what they call it over in Latin America. And that stream of socialism, is based on realpolitik, right? It is based on the fact that in 1998, Hugo Chavez, so these are ads, sorry, but this, Sidney Poitier, God bless him, but he has nothing to do with this. But the fact is that before Chavez took power in 1998, many people who were considering themselves full-on socialists were losing their grip on having any sort of relevance in the political conversation. And many of them were probably contemplating what the future held for the philosophy of Marxism. And Chavez, what he did, thanks to the incompetence of the Venezuelan two-party system before him, which was based around two different centrist parties, COPE and Democratic Action. What he did was he injected the need for internationalist leftism as a counterbalance to globalist corporatism, neoliberalism, something that if you look at a left-wing channel today, you see is a very heavy theme. They despise, right? They despise this idea that the world should be an open marketplace where you can basically open up a factory everywhere. And in many ways, that's where people who are on the populist left and the populist right seem to overlap, right? Well, let's not pretend that this is an exclusive complaint of people on either side. And even what's hilarious is that somebody like Slavoj Žižek, if you know who that is, Slavoj Žižek at one point decided, okay, let me see if I can find this article because I have a lot of tabs open. So he apparently I remember, I think it was in 2018, he tried to say, well, we need to combine nationalism into our socialism. Well, what does that make? I think it's been done before. So sorry I can't find it, but Slavoj Žižek, who is a modern post-Soviet Marxist from Slovenia, he tried to make that sort of connection, and it didn't really make any sense. Now, the Real News Network, how does that come into play? In the 2000s, Chavez was going through a major political crisis in Venezuela, while they were able to fund a lot of his programs using the oil revenue from PDVSA, which plays a heavy role in this story. And I've done many, many stories on PDVSA over the past 3 to 4 years. And if you probably look on YouTube, I don't know if there's another person who focuses on the troubles of PDVSA nearly as much as me in any YouTube context. So while you do have people like Board Empanada, I think his name is. So let me see here. Maybe it was Bad Empanada. So you have Bad Empanada. He is a major supporter of the Chavista cause, and he does many videos trying to justify what's going on with with Venezuela. He's trying to rationalize all of the failures of Venezuela by saying it is the fault of the sanctions, by saying it is the fault of the neoliberals and American imperialism. But it's not, okay? So you have a lot of these people who, let me see here. I don't know if he's criticizing Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton here, but generally, this is a guy, for example, who is a very, very stout apologist for the Bolivian government. Okay? E. Michael, that is PDVSA, exactly. PDVSA. That's how you pronounce it in Spanish. So, essentially, you have over here, Chavez comes to power. He has a real crisis in the 2000s where the media supports, the Venezuelan private media supports a CIA-sponsored coup against him, which is, if you want to be perfectly frank, it is a redemptive issue of his cause for why he was in government. Hugo Chavez came to power because the United States and its security apparatus had undue influence in Venezuela. That's something where I don't think, even if you're the biggest critic of Chavismo, and I despise the Chavista cause, I will never, ever support any sort of government like this. But the fact is, yes, the CIA was intervening in Venezuela many times. So they tried to overthrow him, and the media took his side. So what Chavez decided was that he would form media companies that would be a counterbalance to the pro-American media in Venezuela, which is something that you can understand. What did not end up happening, though, was that it didn't create a competition. It created what Chavez decided would be a controlled media. He started to revoke the licenses of radio stations and TV stations in Venezuela that were, according to him, not compliant with the law. And that type of behavior has nothing to do with being a a supporter of defying the United States. It has to do with wanting to silence your critics. It's censorship, right? It's pretty easy to call it censorship. So if you read through this, it goes through a little bit of the history of Venezuela up to that point. What happened in 2005 was that Venezuela formed the Telesur Combine, this alliance of different networks that are sympathetic to Chavez's government and other pro Chavez governments in Latin America, governments like in especially in Argentina and Cuba, especially, and every one of those governments had a certain share in Telesur, and you can watch Telesur videos even today on YouTube, but they are listed just like with RT and even PBS under YouTube's ridiculous terms. They're listed as state-sponsored networks, right? The real news network is not listed as such, but the fact of the matter is that the people who founded the Real News Network, including Paul Jay, who's over here, they have ties that are direct to Telesur. They have virtually a direct connection to Telesur, and they have had for their entire history. The connection, if you go through the article, it's a 5,000 plus word article. It's the weekend long read on American Greatness, where they've been letting me contribute for the past 7 or 8 months. So this article, it goes through the entire history of that network. And if you look at the people that they feature as experts on the various countries, they have people who are in no way, shape, or form uninterested parties. There are people who have a stake in whatever topic they're talking about, and they themselves, the leaders of this network, are conflicted. And what do I mean by conflicted? Everyone talks about, we were laughing yesterday. I know some of you watch, Michael for sure, I know, watches the Hard News Network. We were laughing about, I think at the end, I actually sent Hard Bastard a super chat. And it was talking about this ridiculous rant by Chris Cuomo, where he's talking about, oh, it's bullshit what I have to do on CNN, and I hate it, and I hate my job and everything. Chris Cuomo being on CNN is in some ways, it's a conflict of interest, because his brother, not only is he the governor of New York, he also was the attorney general of New York. And people forget that he was also the Secretary of Housing under President Clinton. So you have a news network where a person is in a main anchor position who has a direct connection to a major political figure, the governor of one of the largest states in the country, right? New York now is, I believe, the third or fourth most populous state in the country. It's been losing population for decades, been losing population under Cuomo because people move to other states, like they move to Maryland, even, which is ridiculous. If you have to move to Maryland because the taxes are too high where you live, there's definitely something wrong with where you live. They move to Florida, especially if you're a Floridian and you see all these New Yorkers coming in. It's pretty much because of people like Andy Cuomo. But so CNN has an anchor who's connected to that, and they have numerous other figures that they're blatantly conflicted because they are part of the Democratic Party machinery, right? They don't have as many people who are conflicted because they're part of the machinery at what's it called, the Republican Party, right? It's so skewed that you almost find it as if CNN is an extension of the party. So you have to certainly look at the situation at CNN as a network that is conflicted and it cannot objectively report on the news anymore. And if you look at Fox, you could probably make, generally the case is there's no reason why you shouldn't say it about many of these shows. Why would you ever say that Mike Huckabee, who was a governor, why would you say that he can objectively comment on the news? The difference is, it's a very small distinction, but it is still a distinction. They have Huckabee on as an opinion journalist, as an opinion contributor, and they don't have Cuomo on as an opinion contributor. He's an anchor. So there's a bit of a difference, but if we're all being honest, Fox News is the flip side in some cases. They do have a lot of their people. For example, at Fox News they have Hannity and they have what's his name, Tucker Carlson. So they're fully opinionated, and then you have people like Brett Baer and Chris Wallace that are, if you watched Chris Wallace's show, I think you would be completely deluded to suggest that he's on the Trump take. He's probably one of the fiercest critics of Donald Trump that you'll find. Shepard Smith was the same thing, if you remember. Shepard Smith could hardly say a positive thing about the administration. So Impex is saying Dana Perino was press secretary under Bush. I did not know that, and good thing you pointed that out. Is Dana Perino a news presenter or is she an opinion journalist? That's my question. So you have to look at every news publication as a reflection of whether they are biased in a certain way because the people who present it have a conflict of interest. Remember when Chelsea Clinton was given a spot at NBC News and she was given a salary of hundreds of thousands of dollars a year for contributing maybe 5 pieces a year, which I don't think she ever reached anyway. So what we're talking about in terms of the real news, I'll look up Dana Perino, but what we're talking about in terms of the real news is in some ways an even worse. She's a commentator. She is not a. So yes, Dana Perino would fit in the same way as Sean Hannity, in my opinion. So you have at the Real News, you have someone like Sharmini Pierce, she has been, and this is on her biography on the website. She was economic and trade advisor to President Hugo Chavez at Miraflores, which is the presidential palace, and for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Venezuela. You also have Gregory Wilpert, who is married to the former Venezuelan ambassador to Ecuador. So you have out-and-out regime loyalists who are contributing reporters to the show. So so many of you will ask, I'm sure E. Michael might ask, why would you even care? And you don't have to, okay? Because like I said, this network is not a massive network. They only have, so I was watching this show, they only have about 400,000 subscribers on YouTube, and I believe that they also broadcast on Roku. But I'm trying to make the case here that the conflict between the left media and the real world is so strong that when you read about what they're advocating, you have to, like with anyone, ask, where do they benefit financially, right? Just like with anyone. You have to, and I don't think that you necessarily have to go too far. If you don't find anything, then you don't find anything. But just like what they say, they like to say that corporatism is married with American politics, corporatism is married with the American media, and they'd be right in saying that. But then they would have, the old saying is that when you point your finger at someone else, there's 3 pointing back at you. So they have people on their staff. So we'll get to the financial issue. They have people, for example, Vijay Prashad is a member of the Real News contributor team, and he runs what's called the Tricontinental Institute. And the Tricontinental Institute is, so you can actually look this up. He teaches at Trinity College over in Massachusetts, which is in, I think it's in Northampton. And they publish a lot of very, very out and out left stuff, right? So, you know, they're talking a lot about agrarian reform, feminist studies, and all of that. So, and Frantz Fanon. So, if you were growing up in the 70s or the 60s and you were really into far left politics, Frantz Fanon was a huge he was a huge influence. He was a Haitian French philosopher who was talking about, he had a book called The Wretched of the Earth, and it was popular back then. It's sort of almost, you know, nobody really talks about it anymore, but it was part of this whole movement of the new left in the third world, where third world countries were starting to say, well, we need a non-aligned movement that would bring socialism and eventually a communist system to third world countries in order to shake off imperialism. So it was saying that, well, we're going to be non-aligned. We're not going to be on either the Soviet or the American side. But eventually, the country that led the non-aligned movement, all the countries that were part of it, were countries like India, countries like Cuba, that were in their economic system, they were fully socialized, and they were aligned somewhat with the Soviet Union. What people don't remember was that during the Cold War, for a very significant period, India was at least nominally aligned with the Soviet Union. They weren't a Soviet satellite, but the government of Indira Gandhi was much more sympathetic to the Soviet Union, and it was partially because of philosophy. And another reason was because the U.S. and Britain were allied with Pakistan. So Larry says, I seem to recall that Abby Martin and Alonia Minkovsky used to have Vijay Prashad on their respective RT shows. Then again, they also had Lawrence Wilkinson all the time too. So you know, we'll get to Abby Martin, but Vijay Prashad is the head of the Tricontinental Institute, and he tells the story, the meaning of the Tricontinental. In January 1966, the Cuban people hosted the so it's as if suddenly the people of Cuba rose up and they said, let's have a conference. So it says the Cuban people hosted the Tricontinental, a conference of revolutionary movements from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So then they put it in I don't know why they translated it into Spanish, because who cares? Did they translate it into Hindi? No. This conference emerged from two dynamics. States that emerged out of the anti-colonial movement had, by 1961, created the non-aligned movement, which included not only radical regimes, but also those with a more conciliatory attitude towards imperialism. Outside NAM existed movements with unfinished anti-colonial wars of national liberation, which had a more radical edge to them, and which had been gathered together in 1957 in the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organization. The NAM and APSO platforms often collaborated together. They provided the cultural space from which the Tricontinental would emerge. At the Tricontinental, APSO was expanded into the Organization of Solidarity with the Peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. This was, so it says, whose secretariat continues to function in Havana, Cuba. The Tricontinental put down a marker. Peace and socialism were the goals, and whatever means would lead to this goal had to be utilized. Remember, whatever means had to be utilized. From Havana, OSPAL provided the infrastructure for mutual understanding amongst the movements in the three countries. It continues to produce the fabulous magazine Tricontinental, which became famous as the purveyor of emblematic posters that carried forward the message of anti-colonial socialism. From these histories of both the NAM and OSPAL came a series of important initiatives, many rooted in the United Nations. Some of these are intergovernmental organizations, such as the South Center based in Geneva, while others have little governmental support. So you see there's this is a network of organizations. Okay, this is a network of Cuban propagandizing organizations. What unites these initiatives is a commitment to the South, namely to the countries that continue to struggle against the histories and struggles and structures of imperialism, but also to humanity in general. A genuinely South-based social, and so when they say South, this is what's funny. They're not talking about Tennessee. They're talking about the global South, which is the Marxist, the neo-Marxist term for the third world. They don't consider the third world to be an appropriate term anymore because it diminishes the importance of Latin America, Asia, and Africa. So they see calling a country the third world, a third world country. They think of it as derogatory and diminutive. We at the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research are a proud continuation of the heritage of the Tricontinental Conference and are honored to collaborate with OSP AAAL to work towards building a world of peace and justice. We stand, in the words of Frantz Fanon, with the wretched of the earth to create a world of human beings. So this is an organization with Vijay Prashad that openly and they proudly proclaim their allegiance to this Cuban propaganda organization.
In January 1966, the Cuban people hosted
So this is Prashad's voice for those of you that don't know.
the Tricontinental, a conference of revolutionary movements from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. This conference emerged from two dynamics. First, states that came out of the anti-colonial movement had by 1961 created the non-aligned movement, which included not only radical regimes but also those with a more conciliatory attitude towards imperialism. Second, outside the non-aligned movement existed groups with unfinished anti-colonial wars of national liberation which had a more radical edge to them and which had been gathered together in 1957 in the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organization. These two platforms often collaborated together. They provided the cultural space from which the Tricontinental would emerge. At the Tricontinental, the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organization was expanded into the Organization of Solidarity with the Peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, whose secretariat continues to function in Havana, Cuba. The Tricontinental put down a marker. Peace and socialism was the goal, and whatever means would lead to this goal had to be utilized. We at the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research are a proud continuation of the heritage of the Tricontinental Conference. We stand, in the words of Frantz Fanon, with the wretched of the earth to create a world of human beings.
So yeah, this is blatant Cuban propaganda, and I see Larry is saying, well, they have a point though. The global South has had a real struggle with imperialist and new neo-imperialist forces, modernly the IMF. I don't care. I already said that, and the fact is that if you have a country like Cuba that is talking about imperialism and shaking off imperialism, this is a country, Cuba, that fought in wars to expand Soviet power in Ethiopia, which is a third world country, and in Angola. So it's a wash, right? It's basically a lie to say that this is a non-aligned movement talking about creating real independent countries. In point of fact, when you look at all of those countries, like Ethiopia and Angola, when the Soviet funding ran out, they basically the Marxism was just a pretense. They threw it away. It was a joke. Angola, which had fought for 14 years after independence, which came right after a war of independence from Portugal, they'd fought for 14 years in name in order to preserve a Marxist-Leninist government. In 1989, they abandoned Marxism, Leninism, and began to transition to a liberalized economy because there was no point. Because people who live in those countries, they realize that it's just an act. Marxism is a tremendous, when you commit to a philosophy where people, irrespective of achievement, irrespective of ability, irrespective of merit, and irrespective of legal right, have equality based on just the principle of equality, it does not produce a successful economy, and usually society becomes, just this tyrannical hellhole. So that's how it turned out in those countries, and they mostly abandoned it. There is no African country that was a part of that effort that remained Marxist after 1989. So yeah, I don't buy this whole notion that they were defending the wretched of the earth. So yes, Vijay Prashad, who's featured on the show, talks a lot about India, talks a lot about how the Indian government is racist and that Modi is a Hindu bigot and he hates Muslims and everything. It's purely from the it's their interest that this fight with Modi, who's trying to reinstitute Hindu nationalism, which has not been a big thing for a long time, so far as I know. He sees that as this evil menace to quote unquote minorities in India. Why? Because he wants India to be a Marxist internationalist country, just like the rest of the world. He wants every country to have, to basically blend their culture into this tasteless slurry of global Marxism. That's what Marxism is about. That's what internationalism is about. They have their red flags and everything. You can see it in the symbolism, right? He showed a poster at the end. So you see various colors of people all holding up books that are, you have to assume that they're Marxist books around Fidel Castro, right? So it is a fake movement. It has nothing to do with shaking off imperialism. It has to do with imposing their own imperialism. So yeah, I mean, Larry's in the chat. He's talking about the IMF. We talked about the IMF like 15 minutes ago. So I don't think that that's a complaint that's worth addressing. But so there's Sharmini Peers, who was directly a direct advisor on economics and trade to Hugo Chavez. I think I looked into, you see here. So the Tricontinental Institute, it's harder than the other ones because they don't have nearly as big of a budget as the other, as the Real News Network. But in the short time that they've been incorporated, according to public record, they went from having a $40,000 a year budget in what year was this? 2017, and now in 2018. So they went from $40,000 to $860,000, right? So this was these are groups that I think they have an out and out interest in promoting the interests of other countries in the United States, which is not an illegal thing, but it's not about legality. It's about transparency, right? People talk about the influence of Chinese organizations in American media, specifically Bloomberg. They talk about the influence of Israeli interests in media, and you could probably put, National Review in there or Daily Wire, the Christian Zionists, things like that. And this is a huge topic on the left. They hate the Christian Zionists and the evangelicals. And you know what? In this country, you can hate whoever you want. But when you are directly tied to Venezuela, when you have people on your shows who are actually working for Venezuela, like Tariq Ali, like Abby Martin, who, I think gives people in the chat a huge raging hard-on sometimes. People like that, they're not independent journalists. And the Real News talks about, you see them over here. They say about the Real News. Okay, they say, the Real News Network produces independent, verifiable, fact-based journalism that engages ordinary people in solving the critical peoples of our lives. None of the people that appear on the news network are ordinary people. They're mostly conflicted activists who have either a financial stake in what they're doing or they are promoting their ideological agenda. It's not independent. It's not verifiable. It's not fact-based. It is connected to the agenda of the Venezuelan government. And you can see from the, you shall see them through their fruits. Is that how it goes? So Tariq Ali has been featured on the Real News to talk about topics relating to Britain, Pakistan, and the Iraq War. He also hosted the Telesur program, The World Today, such as one from 2015, where he heralded a bright red future for the UK under his close friend and colleague Jeremy Corbyn. The other one, so Abby Martin says, so she arrived at Telesur after RT, which is where Larry apparently watched her every day, which, so she was a liar when she was on RT, and she was a liar on Telesur. And, the fact that RT was willing to have her is a stain on RT, right? Because Abby Martin was a 9/11 truth person, and then suddenly, this is something I did a video about too. When she was a 9/11 truth person, she was talking about how it was all an inside job and everything and controlled demolition. And suddenly, after she got a gig, she stopped talking about it. She never explained ever why she stopped believing in it, if she did. So she's in my opinion, she's a con artist. Okay, you either believe in something and are willing to admit that you were wrong, which is, for example, I went over yesterday. I don't think Larry watched. I know that, let me see, Dade Murphy was not there. If you guys tuned in yesterday, I don't think I see anybody that was on the chat that was there yesterday. I talk about Hunter Avalon saying, I left the right because I don't believe in many things that I did believe. Well, okay, so that's somebody who admits that they had a change of heart. Abby Martin never explained that, why she doesn't believe in controlled demolition, why she doesn't organize anymore for 9/11 Truth, why she's not active in the movement at all, why she doesn't talk about it, why she hasn't used her platform to talk about it. Nothing. So they're fake people. And they have an ideological agenda, but the ideological agenda is driven by the fact that Telesur can give them funds in order to do it. These are pathetic, weak people. Len McCarthy is saying, I thought she disavowed her stance. You can disavow something, but you have to at least rationalize why you disavowed something. If you, and I'm not saying that you have to believe in the controlled demolition theory, but if you're somebody who was on the street marching and yelling through a megaphone about something, and then later you say, well, I don't really think that I was right about it, well, then I believe that you need to explain yourself. It's the same thing I always take when it if God forbid, I don't want to ever be wrong about something, but it does happen. I'm not afraid to at least address it if one of you in the chat asks me about it. I don't see myself as above anyone who's here. Len McCarthy says, I might be wrong. Maybe she downplayed it. It doesn't matter if the fact is that she went on to RT, and this is a person, what was her qualification for presenting a show on RT? I don't know. The only thing she ever did prior to that was talk about the controlled demolition theory and Zionism and things like that. It was the only thing, and there's no other reason. The only other reason I can understand why she goes on RT, why RT featured her, is because she looks like this. She looks
the revolution.
She has like a good complexion.
and what was happening.
She apparently knows how to dress, and her hair is styled well, but that doesn't make, a qualified. I mean, they could pick anyone to do it, right? And she gives like a very emotional delivery. So yes, the Real News, they employ people and they feature people who are direct, spouts for the Venezuelan government's propaganda. So welcome, Arjun. We were just talking about India, so you missed it. So in point of fact, if you look at our program, which we can get to right now, Empire Files, you can go to the very end, okay? And here, let me put it on YouTube so you can see more clearly. So we'll roll the credits. So directed by Abby Martin and Mike Prisner, who happens to be her boyfriend. And then music, title, sequence. 1 second. Is that the wrong program?
— 2017 marks the centennial of one
of the sort of, in other words, achievement.
So the producer of this show is Paul J, though. 1 second. So this is their Real News one. Here we go. So it even says on the, this is Malcolm X's final years. This was in February, right? 55 years after Malcolm X's death, the Real News revisits this documentary, including interviews with Angela Davis and Danny Glover. Danny Glover is a board member of the Real News. Yes, Danny Glover from what's it called? Danny Glover from Lethal Weapon. So, executive producer Paul J, co-production with Telesur, and support from the Bertha Foundation. Actually, I might as well look into that Bertha Foundation now that I'm looking at this. So yes, Paul J has collaborated openly with the Venezuelan government's mouthpiece, Telesur. It's not only what's it called? It's not only the mouthpiece of Venezuela, it's the mouthpiece of Cuba and other Marxist governments in Latin America. Other people that have written for or produced content for the Real News include Greg Wilpert, who so this is the guy, and I've covered him in other videos. So, you can look through my videos, you can find probably a few videos concerning him. His wife is a senior Venezuelan diplomat and former ambassador to Ecuador. And Lucas Kerner, who writes for Wilpert's website and functions as a media critic in defense of the Maduro regime. Like Paul Jay, he is an anti-Zionist Jew and was once arrested for attempting to disrupt the Jerusalem Day Parade. So these are all people that they're not journalists, okay? They're much less like if you think of me as somebody, if you want to, I would probably have more standing to consider myself a journalist than them, because I haven't been arrested as part of a demonstration. I haven't served as an aide to any politician ever. I've never taken money from any politician. I've never taken money from any foreign government in order to publish anything. So that is so, and even with me, if I publish this on my blog, it doesn't matter. So I had to publish it on American Greatness. American Greatness is not quite independent journalism. American Greatness is sponsored by a nonprofit. And if you want to go into that, you're welcome to. But this label of being an independent alternative journalist is, in my opinion, it's one of the most meaningless that's been used in the modern internet era, right? It's completely meaningless. Okay, let me see what Gurky put here. So Gurky says, so Gurky's foxy lady here.
That thing that we Americans call a donut. I'm sorry. I'm just a guy who cares an awful lot about my country.
You, sir, are a fool. You know what? Cut his mic.
Are there terrorist cells in your neighborhood?
Does not want the USA to defeat terrorism.
You cannot be a liberal and a Christian.
Republicans lie.
It's really so stupid.
What's up, guys? Thanks so much for tuning into the brand new show that I've been working super hard all month to bring you. I'm your host, Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set.
Yeah, so that was her show on RT, and it's pretty clear why they had her, because you look at all the ugly people that are on regular. Glenn Beck. Remember when Glenn Beck was on Fox, and you saw Nancy Grace, who's intolerable. And who else was there? Anderson Cooper and, Lawrence O'Donnell, I think, was one of the people. So it is about sex appeal, and it is about, charisma. It's not about truth. And RT, it's to their discredit that they had her on. Because what's the difference between having her on and having someone on the news for, just her huge tatas, right? Well, why should I, like if I could pay someone who had like a nice ass and, all of that. And she would basically, because there's a lot of ass men out there, I would have her basically do the news, with her face facing that way and her ass facing the camera. I would probably be able to build a good following that way too, right? But it wouldn't make my reporting or anything, any work that I do more true or not. And there's people, this is what is, Chris Cuomo was talking yesterday. Oh, I'm so sad. CNN doesn't let me feel fulfilled or whatever. So that's not what news is about anymore. It's not about actually reporting things that are that matter or anything. And you can make the argument that this article that is in the description doesn't matter. The one that's linked in the description for you. You can make this article. You can make the point that doesn't matter either, because if the topic doesn't matter to you and if it's not commercially appealing, yeah, it doesn't matter at all, right? I'm sure that a lot of you people, if I wasn't talking about the real news, if I wasn't talking about Venezuela, it probably wouldn't matter because it doesn't matter for you living where you do. So it's the challenge of a person creating the story to make it relevant to the audience that it's presenting it to. And Abby Martin is good at doing that, but she's not good at reporting the facts because she is a liar, she's conflicted, she's dishonest, she's not being forthcoming about her real beliefs concerning 9/11, which she's never explained since she got a gig on RT And that's why you can't trust her, and that's why alternative media isn't really alternative media. All you have to do, if you want to trust a media source, is see whether the facts are verifiable, see whether they can be corroborated. You don't have to be a quote-unquote alternative journalist to do it. There's plenty of journalists who are not stylistic and have like a very nice marketing scheme to do that. Let me see here. So, yeah, I think RT is right. Really, the fact that they had her on was a show of how low their standards are. So another thing is, so Lucas Kerner was one of the other people I talked about, and this is a person who, to give you an idea of how cultish the far left is, when another Real News contributor / guest criticized the Venezuelan government and said that there's a problem with the government and therefore it's harder and harder to stand by them, but he was at the same time saying that there's no justification for intervening in Venezuela, Lucas Kerner wrote this massive piece that was about how, even though Gabriel Hetland said that he is against intervention in Venezuela, what he's effectively doing is saying that he is for it. So they don't allow even the minimum of disagreement. And remember, I'm someone who has been a consistent opponent of the Venezuelan government. I used to have Venezuelan commentators on the channel all the time when it was more active. And the point is that, Venezuelans living here, but still, the point is that if you can't have the minor disagreement about the success and validity of the Venezuelan government and what it's doing, while still agreeing that it's wrong to intervene in Venezuela, if you're not willing to entertain that, then what are you? You're just a regime mouthpiece. You're basically loyal to a government. You're not loyal to any principle. You're loyal to a regime, right? That's basic, and you can read that. I can put this in the chat if you're interested. I know not all of you are the reading type, but you can read this. It's basically trying to force people to sorry, I just looked at my notifications. It's like having people say, look, not only do you have to support the course of action that I'm talking about, you have to support it for the right reasons. Right? Or else you're an enemy and you can't be trusted. That's the mentality on the left. That's why it's very schismatic. That's why you have people right now that the progressive movement is basically falling apart day by day because nobody can agree which way. You have the Democrats who are saying you have to support our nominee no matter what. You have people who are part of the more confrontational left. People who would probably watch the Real News Network saying, no, our vote isn't for sale and we're not going to comply and all of that. So this is the type of material that they put out. Now, I will say that Paul Jay, who's the person who founded the Real News Network, he did put out material in the past that was a more honest take on what was going on. This is from his actual website, right? Theanalysis.news, because he's no longer at the Real News Network. Okay? He was booted last year. Nobody knows why. They have a lot of his archived stuff is here. So, and some of it's actually interesting. So this is the Albanian Journey, which was his documentary released in 1995.
60 miles across the Adriatic from Italy, Albania is one of the least known and understood countries in the world. Some called it a repressive police state, isolated and fanatic, the most backward country in Europe. Others said it was a small country defending its independence and traditions. building a society with social equality. We discovered the truth was more complicated than easy stereotypes.
So this is Paul J. Okay.
Information since we began making this film in 1987. During the first 15 years.
See? This is the same guy. This is the guy who founded the Real News, and he journeyed to Albania. And you see, arriving at the airport, you see an armed communist soldier over there. And this is the type of thing that he thinks is up for discussion. If you think that it's normal, you know, growing up in America I remember after 9/11, it was kind of a shock to see armed National Guardsmen at the airport after 9/11. And every airport I've been to airports in Austria, I've been to airports in I haven't traveled a lot, for those of you that don't know, but Austria, France, Canada, it's been very unusual, Israel, to see armed soldiers. But apparently he didn't really see this as an oddity. So this is what's so odd, that they look at communist governments as being a refuge from imperialism and from military might and the force of the state on the people. But the truth is that that's exactly what they're upholding. Those governments are uniformly enforced by massive armed state apparati, if you want to call it that. Albania was the last remaining Stalinist state. Yeah, and this documentary, which you should watch if you have, what is this, like I think it's like 45 minutes long. Yeah, it's like a little more than 45 minutes. So you can watch this and you see him. The truth is that the country, as a socialist country, there's no doubt that something has to change, that it's been stagnant for 50 years, and this guy's hedging around it. But you can see that he knows that this is wrong. And then, therefore, it took the rise of Chavez to make him to give him hope that socialism could work again, which it didn't. And ironically, as the lessons of the Hoxha regime in Albania are reliving themselves in Venezuela, he's one of the biggest apologists for Venezuela, because he's no longer at the Real News Network. The other thing is, so this is a major issue, and it's something that I left to the end, is that you've married on the one hand green activism, eco activism. You've married those two issues, eco-activism and socialism. And this is something that's been a heavy theme at the Real News Network, okay? Another thing is, so before I forget, the person that Abby Martin interviews about the Russian Revolution is not some unbiased person. She just introduces him. Here, let's listen to how she introduces him. So I did make a full-length video about this back in, I think, 2017. So you could go back and watch it, because this was the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. And Empire Files which is Telesur's program at the time, it's not on Telesur anymore. They made a program in honor of the Russian Revolution.
2017 marks the centennial of one of the biggest events in human history. 100 years ago, a huge chunk of the planet became ruled by workers and peasants with a socialist economy, with the success of the Russian Revolution. 14 other nations joined Russia into what became the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, shifting a balance of power in a world that had long been dominated by lords and barons. Critics and supporters can agree. The Soviet Union shook the world, ushering in a period of social revolution. breaking of old colonial bonds, and a challenge to the reigning system of capitalism. All of that started on November 7, 1917. To learn more about this event, I sat down with Brian Becker, longtime socialist organizer and co-author of the new book Storming the...
So the person she introduces, Brian Becker, she introduces as a socialist organizer. What she doesn't introduce is that Brian Becker is from the Party of Socialism and Liberation. So he is first of all, he's the person who founded it, right? He's the member of the PSL's political committee, right? And he's been a pro-Cuba campaigner for over 20 years, right? So this isn't over 30 years, in fact. So this isn't a person who can say, "Oh, I am just a commentator. I'm a socialist activist." He is a very pro-Cuba person, right? Apparently he met with the Nation of Islam too. So Brian Becker is so they don't, she doesn't mention who these people are. She labels them deceptively, just like mainstream media does. So they're not really alternative media. They're media that's skewed in a different way, right? So let me see here. So on that note, because they're so entwined with Venezuela, it's very contradictory that they would have such a sympathetic viewpoint towards a country whose economy is completely dependent on petroleum, on oil export, which, by the way, they can't even do right now because they ruined their oil industry. They're so completely dependent on petroleum, yet they wax environmentalists. They try to say, oh, climate justice must come, okay? This was a story that they did in 2014. What will it take to create climate justice, right? In 2011, they called it an imperative, right? Criticizing Obama for cap and trade, which undermines support for action on climate change. So all of this is while they are basically supporting a government that is entirely dependent on fossil fuels. There is no other revenue-producing industry in Venezuela anymore because the Chavez government destroyed it all. They scared away all the manufacturing, all of the service industries, and the ones that do exist, they don't necessarily help the government, right? Because if they're in private hands, they're likely trying to avoid helping the government. And the truth of the matter is that they did have, okay, you have to remember, in 2019, there was, this video, if you remember, where people were blasting Beto O'Rourke for taking money from fossil fuel executives, while at the same time, and this had to do with the Sunrise Movement, right? And they were blasting him for taking money from fossil fuels executives. And the truth is that the real news is invested in fossil fuels. Okay, they did have an interview with this person, this ambiguously gendered person, Vic Barrett, about fossil fuels because she was suing the government because they wanted the government to pay reparations to young people in America for ruining their future through fossil fuels. This is a real news interview, okay?
I'm here at Netroots Nation 2019 in Philadelphia, and I'm here with Vic Barrett, who is one of the plaintiffs in Juliana versus the United States, which is a lawsuit. These folks are essentially suing the federal government for refusing to take climate action and for fueling the climate crisis. Thanks for being here, Vic.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
How old are you, and how did you become involved in the fight for climate justice?
Yeah, I'm 20 years old, and I got involved in the climate justice movement when I was 14. I was doing after-school programs with nonprofits in New York City, Global Kids, and I was working with the Human Rights Activist Project, and working with the...
So the quality of this is, I mean, you can see it because the real news actually calls him a defendant in the lawsuit. But if you're if you're submitting the lawsuit, you're not the defendant, you're the plaintiff. I don't think you have to be, I mean, Larry, when do they teach you that in law school? Because I know Larry talks about law. I think he's a practicing lawyer himself, which is I don't think he necessarily does, litigation, but
Human Rights Activist Project, I learned a lot about the intersections of justice and climate change and how that applies to my life and people who look like me, particularly in New York City with low-income housing and housing that's predominantly lived in by people of color, more frequently being put in the front lines of climate change. And I just realized the injustice in the injustice that so many people of color are facing coming from all directions. And I just felt like climate was the issue that I had to work on and dedicate my time to.
Yes, this is how they selected their climate spokespeople, right? So, this is a Lucas Kerner piece, by the way, where they're criticizing NPR for calling for regime change in Venezuela. I don't remember NPR ever doing that. So, the truth is that they do take money and invest it in climate change, because I'll explain this. In 2016, I think it was either 2016 or 2017, I noticed there was a real news post where they were talking about one of their fundraisers. And it turned out that they raised their money through the Kitty Plas Foundation. So this is how I got into this, and it was 4 years ago. I think it was 4 years ago. And they took that post down. I can't find it anymore. But there is an archive of a different one of their spring fundraiser from 2014 from the Real News. Okay, so the URL is up here. I don't even know if the URL still works. So I did look for the archive. So yeah, they've taken that down. So they don't have a record of that. But there is a record from from the web archive, and they actually said, well, we have this family foundation called Kitty Plas, okay, down here, right? QUITIPLAS, and they are kind enough to donate us money. But the real truth is that the Kitty Plas Foundation, they bought their Baltimore headquarters for $1.3 million back in 2012. And they've been pumping money into the Real News ever since then, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. And then the rest of it, I believe the Real News raises from, viewer philanthropy, viewer donations and things like that. So these are people that they believe specifically in this far left communist ideology, but this foundation, Kitty Plas, which is their main it's their main revenue source. It doesn't have a website. It doesn't have any other public information except for its address in Delaware and its 990 tax disclosures. And when you look at the tax disclosures, first of all, so there's an organization called Son of Kitty Plas, registered under Paul J's name, that is currently not in good standing, probably because it was just closed or something, from the Maryland Department of Assessments and Taxation. So that organization was probably a different vehicle that he was using in order to funnel cash to his various things. Larry, the question was, if you're suing someone, are you the plaintiff or the defendant? So, because they said that the person who was being interviewed is the defendant, even though he was suing the U.S. government. So in any case, so you can go through. They created a second nonprofit called Independent World Television, and the fact is that if you look at the boards of directors for Independent World Television and the Real News Network, they overlap very, very closely. Independent World Television and the Real News Network both have Danny Glover on its board of directors, right? Glover wrote a eulogy for Chavez in 2014 with fellow board member James Early, who serves as an assistant provost and author at the Smithsonian Institute. So this is the big, so exactly, Larry Gerke, the plaintiff sues and the defendant defends, right? So whatever, let's call it a typo. But in any case, Danny Glover is the big name in this because he happens to be a trustee and not trustee, but a director of both of these things. So it could be, by the way, that Danny Glover has a financial investment in a communist propaganda outlet, right? Which wouldn't be very unusual if you know anything about Danny Glover. It's very funny. I was watching Lethal Weapon last week, not because of this, but because I didn't have anything to do. And it's very funny. I wonder how a political conversation would have gone down between Mel Gibson and who's also brilliant, but Mel Gibson and Danny Glover, given the very divergent views they have on various topics, right? I could only imagine. So another board member is listed as the president of Kitty Plus. So a thing to be conscious of is the word Kitty Plus. Quitiplas. Okay, here you go. So Kitty Plus has only one usage. Okay, it's not even a Spanish word. Kitty Plus. Whoops, I didn't even want foundation. Just Kitty Plus. So this is the Kitty Plus. It is a musical instrument, and you can see the baseball cap on this guy's head. It's from Venezuela. So that's enough of that, but it's a percussion instrument over there. And the bottom line is that the board member who's listed as the president of Kitty Plus, his name is Tom Scruggs, TM Scruggs. I don't know why he calls himself TM. And he's an ethnomusicologist who taught at, guess what country? He taught at the University of the Andes in Mérida, which is in what country? Venezuela. And he's also taught at University of Iowa and Florida International University. The only known work that he's produced that's been published is a pamphlet honoring the musician Victor Jara, who is a Chilean communist who was murdered by Pinochet, right? So this is the entwinement of them. And then, so you're probably saying right now, so what? So all these people who all love Venezuela and Danny Glover, they're all on this network, and they're all, they feature some stuff from Telesur. And what's the problem? What is the problem, Ramon? Who cares, right? What's the point? The point is that they've been hiding through that foundation the fact that a lot of the assets that go into it are tethered to investments in PDVSA, right? In 2013, they had $800,000 in bond holdings for PDVSA, okay? On top of that, the foundation owned almost $3 million in 8.75% interest bonds for Argentina, which in 2014 would default on its debt. So they had massive investment in sovereign bond debt for two different countries that happen to have been investors in what network? In Telesur, which is owned by those two countries. So we were talking about Danny Glover and Danny Glover's buddies basically using money that was tied up and leveraged in those countries as a means to support a network in the United States that publishes favorable coverage of Venezuela, right? E. Michael is saying Venezuela, exactly. That's how they usually say it. I could never get that. I speak Spanish, but I never understood why a lot of them, they don't pronounce the letter V, because why not? You're going to have two letters. And by the way, in Arabic, there's no letter P. Usually they'll say, there's an old joke that this is something I heard back in the day. So the president of Egypt, Mubarak, comes back home from a trip to the United States, and he says, from now on every door you're going to have a little panel and it's going to have my name on it. And everybody's like, what the hell are you talking about? Well, why? What kind of idea is this? He's like, well, they have it in the United States. They're like, what? He's like, yeah, on every door that opens outward, you have the word Bush, 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 right? So because there's no letter P in Arabic, right? So that's the joke. I know it's kind of a retarded dad joke, but there it is. So the other thing, so Kitty Plas had investments in Sandridge Mississippian Trust, an American fund that holds royalties in oil and gas properties in states like Oklahoma and Kansas. So look, maybe they don't own it anymore, because the truth is you don't get like the latest 990 form for any of these organizations for Kitty Plas or IWT is available from 2018. So in all, given that, it's possible that they divested from Mississippian Trust. But even if true, they've been calling for divestment from fossil fuels for the better part of the last 13 years, since The Real News was founded in 2007. All the while, the family foundation that's been supporting them has mainly been invested in funds like Sandridge Mississippian and PDVSA that are invested in what? Fossil fuels. And more than that, they had, the same foundation contributed hundreds of thousands of dollars to the Center for Economic and Policy Research. CEPR is a think tank that is an apologist for Venezuela. Okay, their founder, Mike Weisbrot, published an article in The Guardian in 2013 that says, sorry, Venezuela haters, this economy is not the Greece of Latin America. Well, I think 7 years later, they'd love to be Greece because it's worse. He was a co-writer of the screenplay for South of the Border, Oliver Stone's 2009 documentary about Chavez and the Latin American pink tide. So they love Venezuela. They're conflicted. They are basically just people who are, they are completely in line with the Venezuelan government. The overlap is beyond coincidental at this point. They have investments in Venezuelan government holdings. They also have this bizarre agenda where they're talking about the U.S. divesting from fossil fuel. How does that make sense? Let's say the United States was to ban fracking. Let's say the United States was to end extraction of oil in offshore and in the Gulf of Mexico and near the Gulf of Mexico, near Houston and in the San Francisco Bay and in Alaska and everywhere. We were to completely wean the economy off of fossil fuels. Renewable energy, as it is today, would be completely incapable of satisfying the transportational and energy needs of this country. We would have to go to nuclear energy, which, by the way, the green people are also against. So for a long time, we would probably be importing fuel, and therefore the price of fuel would just skyrocket in the United States. Now, I'm not saying that they think that they're going to get it accomplished, that we're going to ban fossil fuels in the United States. But the more restrictions they can put on it, the more they can make it difficult to extract fossil fuels, and the more expensive that they can make it. Who does it benefit? It benefits their government. It benefits their economy. E. Michael says, I thought Venezuela was going the route of blockchain and cryptocurrency. Well, the trouble with that is the Venezuelan cryptocurrency, the petro, was pegged to their petroleum assets. And from what I understand, I have to take a look at it, but it just hasn't really panned out for them. So I'm looking now. It hasn't really done any, it hasn't made a dent in it, okay? So according to Cointelegraph, Maduro, who's the new president of Venezuela since 2014, has been paying these doctors in petros. So, it's while the Maduro administration claims the petro is worth roughly $60, popular trading platforms used by Venezuelans currently list the token for roughly between 20 and 26 bucks. However, with Venezuelan monthly minimum wages equating to 361 plus 289 in food stamps and doctors estimated to earn little more, one petro could equate to several months of work. So it's just a fundraising mechanism for him, and apparently it's not working quite. It's the same manipulation that he does with the petro he does with everything else. He's done with his own currency, that they overvalue their currency when in reality the bolivar is worthless. That's the paper currency of Venezuela. It's worth a tiny fraction of what its official rate goes as. And the petro is also overvalued, and probably once people, first of all, people have an option of not investing in the petro. The Venezuelan people don't have anything that they can do because the petro is largely inaccessible for them, but people abroad can use it. So it's basically a vehicle for Venezuela to earn money from foreign crypto investors who don't really care about the corruption that he's been spreading. But I don't think that in terms of the long-term model, I don't think the petro is going to be a sustainable venture for them. But, I could be wrong. So, again, he's gone, Paul J., and the Real News continues to feature a lot of Venezuelan propaganda, but most of it isn't from Telesur English because the network is basically not really as functional as it used to be. There's no revenue. People like Abby Martin aren't featured anymore because they didn't have money to produce her show, so she has to now produce it using donations. So she's technically independent now. So long story short, I want you guys to take this, share it. Take this article and share it. It is in the description. It's now in the chat as well. Talk about it. Talk about, Danny Glover, right? Talk. So whatever you want to do, this is the product of 4 years of research on my part. I've explained most of what I'm talking about, but there's a lot more detail in the article. It's 5,000 words. I guarantee that if you read it, you'll understand. Maybe you don't care about Venezuela. Maybe you don't care about the far left and the Real News Network. Maybe you don't think that this is significant enough to devote 5,000 words and a few years of just following this and researching it. But I guarantee that you'll have an understanding after this of why eco-socialism is a huge charade. They don't really believe in what they're talking about. It's a smokescreen for other interests that have an agenda where they would love to see us abandon fossil fuels prematurely. And that's about it. I'm glad most of you actually stuck by, especially I think Michael was here from the beginning, but I'm not going to be streaming or uploading the next couple of days because it's the last 2 days of Passover, and I am Jewish, but might be available during the weekend if somebody wants to stream. And, of course, Lennon's in the chat. You can check his show on Saturday night, very, very late on Saturday. So you can check out his show with Swarthy Immigrant. And that's about it. Please like, share, and subscribe. You can also find me on these following platforms. And that's about it. Talk to you later.